Thank you, Mr Speaker. I speak to stand on the appropriations debate, and I particularly wish to address the government's economic strategy. The government speakers, in between attacking the Labor Party, have outlined an economic strategy of 6 different elements, and I think it's important that we actually address the government's strategy. One of the key elements that they've addressed is the issue of changing the tax system. And there in particular they've talked about the changes they're making to income tax rates. It's worth noting that the changes overall to the tax system are negative in terms of fiscally negative. That is, the government is going to have to borrow around $1 billion in order to pay for its tax changes. Now, it seems to me that a government that is already running a deficit borrowing for more tax cuts is actually fiscally irresponsible, and I am genuinely surprised that the Minister of Finance, who quite rightly makes quite a big deal of the fact that he tries to be fiscally responsible, put forward a budget this year that involved borrowing very large amounts of money to fund tax cuts. The second part of those tax cuts is that they tend to go towards the wealthy. New Zealand already has dramatic inequality. We are one of the most unequal countries within the OECD, and that has enormous costs. The fact that we're so unequal is closely linked to the fact that we have one of the highest imprisonment rates, we have very high crime rates, we have real problems with health and education, and those are linked to the fact that we have a highly unequal society. The changes the government's making in terms of income tax rates and in terms of hiking GST will result in a more unequal New Zealand, and that will have all those downstream effects. It's also notable that the other change that the government introduced was around lowering the company tax rate. That was done on the mistaken belief, of course, that Australia would lower its company tax rate further, and New Zealand had to follow it. As it turned out, they didn't. But putting that to one side, it's interesting to look at the Inland Revenue Department advice on lowering the company tax rate, because what the IRD said is that the major beneficiaries from the lower company tax rate will be foreign companies, and that foreign companies operating in New Zealand actually have a much higher rate of return on equity than New Zealand companies. The reason that the IRD gave for this differential between the return on equity of New Zealand companies versus overseas companies is that overseas investors in New Zealand tend to target monopolistic or oligopolies where they can maximise their profit rate. So those sectors of the economy where there is very little competition, such as the banking sector where there is very little competition aside from Kiwibank, the foreign investors target those sectors in order to have higher rates of profit. So by cutting our company tax rate, we are rewarding those foreign companies that are involved in the New Zealand economy not to export overseas. Most of the foreign companies involved in New Zealand are not export companies. That's what the IRD advice said. These companies are in fact largely rentiers. They're simply getting an above-average rate of return. They're getting an economic rent from their investment in New Zealand for very little benefit for New Zealand. The big investment, of course, in the telecommunications sector is another example of overseas investors just seeking an economic rent and producing very little for New Zealand. So the changes that they're introducing in the tax system, not only will they make New Zealand more unequal, not only will they result in a higher debt for the New Zealand government, around an extra $1 billion, but they also reward foreign companies against the best advice of IRD. So the tax changes they're making, it's hard to see how they're part of any kind of coherent strategy. The second part I wanted to talk about in terms of the government strategy is they talked about infrastructure investment. Now, there are some parts of the government's infrastructure investment which I think make sense. I think the grid upgrade makes a lot of sense. If we're going to have a number of sources of renewable energy throughout the grid, we need to have the grid in good shape. I also think making sure that we have high-speed internet people have access to high-speed internet is also very important, particularly in a world where energy prices are very likely to be higher, particularly transport energy prices. People being able to work from home and having access to high-speed internet is a good idea. And I think you can have a question over whether a fixed wire system, that having the wires rather than having other forms of delivering the internet is the best way to do it, but nonetheless getting high-speed internet is a good idea. Likewise, the buildings for schools is a good idea, and particularly the home insulation, which normally wouldn't be thought of as a piece of infrastructure, but in a way it is a piece of infrastructure that's incredibly valuable to New Zealand, both in terms of reducing health costs, making sure that kids go to school more often, and making people warmer and drier. The part of the government's infrastructure program that I think is particularly absurd, and there's really no other way to think about it, is the motorway investments. Of course, these are the same wasted money that the previous government followed through, and Labor and National share this kind of obsession or fetish with building motorways. This is in a world where, quite recently actually, Lloyd's of London produced a report talking about rising oil prices and said that governments around the world need to look at alternatives to relying on oil and becoming dependent on oil. We've now had more than a decade, I guess, a decade of governments, and no doubt we're planning to have more, a decade of governments who want to increase the New Zealand economy's dependence on imported oil. This is in a world where we're somewhere near the peak rate of oil production, where the price of oil will only become more expensive in time, in a world where we're having to constrain our greenhouse emissions, or we certainly will have to constrain our greenhouse emissions, and yet we are building the infrastructure that will result in increased dependence on oil. We're building the infrastructure that will result in more greenhouse emissions. Not only that, we're having to borrow money in order to do it and waste vast amounts of our taxes on these white elephants. I think the Treasurer talked about $10.7 billion over the next decade he plans to waste on new motorway projects. And the ridiculous thing also about the Treasurer's contribution on infrastructure was that he talked about how they wanted to upgrade the decision-making process before they make infrastructure investment decisions. Now, we know from the papers that we forced out of the government that the benefit-to-cost ratios, for example, on Stephen Joyce's Holiday Highway north of Auckland, are actually less than one. That is, for every dollar they spend on it, they will get less than $1 in return, looking at the most generous interpretations of benefit-to-cost ratios. So we know that the decision-making around these major infrastructure projects is actually very, very poor, because it's political decision-making, these highways of national significance, that they have randomly, well, not randomly, they've politically selected. And now the government wants to talk about that they've upgraded the decision-making process for infrastructure investment, when in fact their own studies showed that these investments they're making in motorways are actually very poor quality investments and a large amounts of waste of money. Of course, what it's actually about is Stephen Joyce running in Rodney next time and getting Mr Lockwood Smith onto the National Party list so that Stephen Joyce can win the Rodney seat by building the Holiday Highway. That's the actual decision-making process for how we ended up spending billions of dollars on the Holiday Highway. If we look at the third part of their program is the so-called regulatory reform. Now, for those of you who are unaware of it, the last time National got their hands on regulatory reform, they implemented the Building Act, which was a laissez-faire piece of regulatory reform, which resulted in leaky houses. Now, the Building Act has cost or will cost the New Zealand economy around $20 billion, according to reasonably conservative estimates, in order to fix the problem created by the last time the National Party interfered with the Building Act. The Building Act 1991, a laissez-faire piece of regulation which said we don't really care, just put up whatever you like, that resulted in massive cost. So while it kind of is very attractive in the short term for the government to say, well, we're saving money in the short term, the long-term costs are enormous. Likewise, when the government weakens the laws around irrigation and protecting rivers, for example, that has a dramatic impact on our clean and green reputation further down the track. The other part of the program that I wanted to touch on was the government's approach to innovation. Now, it seems like the government's strategy is what I would call an extractive strategy. It's very much focused on mining both minerals, oil and also water. The innovative strategy really does seem to be missing. We need a clean technology strategy for the New Zealand economy, a strategy that says we want to make the most of the international market for clean technologies, which is only increasing over time, but the government seems to pay no attention to the green economy and seems to have no understanding that the future opportunities in the globe for a country like New Zealand lie in the green economy, an economy where clean tech, green tech high-tech products and services are going to be very much in demand, and New Zealand would be in a position to supply those. So when you look at a number of the government strategies, they do not seem to be addressing some of the big issues facing us. How do we move our economy towards a much more sustainable basis? How do we reduce our carbon emissions? How do we reduce our dependence on oil? Are all serious issues that simply seem to be completely missed in the government's economic strategy. And I think for that reason the Green Party does not support that economic strategy.